Hello and welcome to Vermont Edition's continuing election coverage. I'm Jane Lindholm, and today we bring you the debate between the major party candidates for Vermont Auditor of Accounts. The auditor is responsible for tracking how the state spends taxpayer money and making sure that government programs are performing the way that they should. The seat is wide open after Democrat-turned-Republican Tom Salmon has declined to run again. So the challengers vying for the office who we'll hear from today are Vince Illuzzi and Doug Hoffer. Vince Illuzzi grew up in Montpelier and was elected to the state Senate in 1980, where he has served for the last 32 years. Illuzzi also serves as the Essex County State's Attorney, and he has a law degree from UVM. He's running on the Republican ticket. Doug Hoffer came to Vermont in 1988 to work for the City of Burlington in the Community and Economic Development Office. For nearly 2 decades, he's been a self-employed policy analyst. For some of that time, he worked under contract to the state auditor. He has a law degree from SUNY Buffalo, and he's running on the Democrat and Progressive tickets. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jane.
Here is the format today. So far, we're all in agreement.
Right.
All of the candidates for the debates agree to this format. In the first round, I will ask the candidates some questions. In the second round, they'll have a chance to ask one another questions. And in the final round, we will have questions from our listeners. And listeners, if you'd like to ask a question of our candidates, you can email it now to vermontedition@vpr.net. And candidates, please limit your answers to 60 seconds, and there will be opportunities for follow-up questions and answers as well.
Is the 60 seconds like it was last night on the presidential debate?
I am going to be tougher than Candy Crowley. You're going to be stuck to 60 seconds.
All right.
So the first question, the job of auditor has been called by some the most important job in state government that nobody knows about, and it might be said often nobody seems to care about. Doug Hoffer, you've said that you're a numbers and data guy, and that's why you want the office and what you'd focus on. Vince Illuzzi, you've said that you'd go beyond the numbers and look at ways to make government more efficient. So, first question, what is your top priority and your vision for the job? Vince Illuzzi.
Well, thanks, Jane. My top priority at the present time would be to address a systemic problem that I've seen in state government, and that is the tens of millions of dollars that have been spent for IT purchases that have gone nowhere. If you consider how much the average Vermonter pays by way of state income tax, and then figure out how many Vermont tax returns you'd have to put together to total the $5 million the judiciary just spent, which appears to be for not good reason, not a good product, the $17 million that DMV spent with no result. I think we have a serious problem with IT purchases across state government. It's a crisis that's developing, and that would be a priority going in the door to see if we can stop that hemorrhaging, turn that around, and put into place best practices and protocols to avoid it from happening again.
So in other words, you'd be auditing all of those various IT purchase accounts.
Performance auditing across state government to come up with some common denominators, some best practices, so that we get a handle on these millions that are being misspent.
You just mentioned that these would be performance audits, and I want to make that clear to people who aren't really all that familiar with what the auditor does. There are audits of financial accounts, and then there are these performance audits that determine the efficiency and effectiveness of government agencies and policies. So what exactly, how would you parse that, what you would do for these financial audits, and which performance audits beyond the IT policies would you go after?
All right. Well, the state auditor's office, one of the smallest in the United States, has a very strong professional staff. They do, in part, the financial audits. The large part of it is contracted out at present to KPMG. It's bid out. It comes up every 3 years. It's extended or a new vendor comes in. The other half of the office, which I think is exciting and in which I think my years of experience would lend support to, are performance audits, where you go into a department, agency, program grantee, and you see whether the money is being spent as directed by the General Assembly, whether it's being spent as efficiently as possible, and whether it's actually making a difference in the lives of Vermonters who have invested in those programs. Those are the performance audits, and that's the akin to the performance audit that would be done with regard to IT purchases, to see why there have been problems, what protocols are in place now, and then move beyond that to develop best practices that apply across state departments and agencies.
You've also said that you'd like to look at some of the Irene rebuilding that's been done in the state. Would those be financial audits or performance audits?
Probably a little of both, but more on the financial side. As I've traveled around the state, I've heard complaints, even to this day, contracts being issued without going through the bidding process. And we need to, although that was an anomaly, at least by Vermont history, last time we had a significant flood of that extent was 1927. Nonetheless, we have to make sure that should there be another calamity of that significance and scope, that we have in place the proper protocols. Obviously, for the first week or 2 weeks or 3 months, a number of no-bid contracts were issued, but to continue to be issuing them this day and using the Irene incident as the basis, I'm not sure is proper. And for that reason, I think we have to sample what's happened, respond to the complaints, the consumer complaints that have come in, and see if we can, again, put into place best practices and protocols to avoid that from continuing, because the taxpayer is not assured that their tax dollars are being spent as efficiently as possible, the best possible price for the best outcome.
Doug Hoffer, for you, what would your priorities be, your position on the job?
Well, thank you, Jane. It's good to be here. I have worked on performance auditing. That began in the late 90s under Ed Flanagan when I worked under contract to him. I have a fair bit of experience, including 5 years in the office. But I have some more prosaic, important things, I think, that, not more important, but equally important, that I'm interested in right away. And they involve transparency and accountability. I really believe that while they're not knocking on the door asking questions about the internal operations of the office, people have a right to know how much money is being spent and for what. So I will put the auditor's budget on the web site immediately, including the details about contracts with outside vendors. In addition, I think it's very important not only for taxpayers and others to know the cost of each audit performed, particularly the discretionary ones, but it's important for the staff and for the auditor and the managers themselves to know, because that's important as to how they make choices for discretionary audits. Are they likely to get a return for that investment? So those costs are going to go on the site as well.
Do you think the current auditor's office is not doing a good enough job in being transparent?
No, I don't. The budget is not online. There's a PowerPoint presentation that is basically what they offered to the Appropriations Committee, but it's very general, not any details. In addition, they do not provide information about the cost of each audit, discretionary or otherwise. They provide an aggregate figure to the Secretary of Administration each year, but not for each one. And furthermore, I think they haven't been terribly focused, and I think the resource can be better utilized. You've
actually criticized the auditor's office for the average amount spent on each of those audits. How much do you think is appropriate to spend on an audit? You've categorized them as about, on average, I think it is $158,000 per audit. So what would you spend?
I'll put that in context first. That represents the equivalent of 2 staffers working each for an entire year. That's 4,000 hours of time. And I worked in the office and did some of that work, and that's incomprehensible to me that it would take that long. I don't see any reason why the average can't drop by half. The point is, they spent $2.4 million in 3 years and got 15 reports. I think we can do a lot better.
What about this idea of the financial accounts, financial audits versus performance audits? What type of performance audits would you be conducting?
Well, as Vince indicated, most of the financial auditing is done by KPMG with some assistance from staff. When you come in the door, as you know, you take office in the middle of a fiscal year. So there's going to be some things already on track that began last week, last month, 3 months ago, whatever. So you got to talk to staff and find out what's happening. As for priorities, there are some things that are of interest to me. The state now spends about $300 million a year on what are called personal service contracts. Some of that is outsourced work that used to be done by state employees. I think we need to start looking at some of the big ones, 1, if possible 2 each year. In addition, I'm curious about something, the flip side of an issue I've spent a lot of time on, as has my opponent. We talk often about tax policy, but I think we also need to look at, are we collecting the tax dollars that are due? And the IRS estimates periodically that there are huge amounts of money sheltered illegally. And I think, at a time when we're looking under rocks for money, we have to make sure we're getting all the money that's due.
You're listening to the Vermont Edition debate between Doug Hoffer and Vince Illuzzi for the open state auditor's seat. Listeners, if you have a question for the candidates, you can send it now to vermontedition@vpr.net. Later in the debate, the candidates will be answering listener questions. Question number 2. In the last couple of years, we've really seen a rash of high-profile embezzlement cases where municipal employees stole from town coffers. One incident alone involved the theft of $1.6 million. And Vermont was ranked at the top of an annual study on states at high risk of embezzlement. Tom Salmon, the outgoing auditor, created a red flag checklist for towns to use to see if they're vulnerable to employee embezzlement and encouraged the legislature to mandate that town officials send a checklist to the auditor's office. The auditor monitors state funds, not municipal funds. But what can or should the auditor do to curb what appears to be a major problem with local employees stealing money from town finances? Doug Hoffer.
Well, first, it's painful anytime taxpayer money is taken illegally or misused. But you mentioned that there was an organization that ranked us third worst in the country. I looked at that methodology and I don't buy it. But that aside, it is a problem of some magnitude. As you noted, the auditor does not have authority to act on non-education municipal affairs. Having said that, there's no reason why the auditor can't provide assistance, technical assistance, and otherwise. By the way, the list that was put together by this auditor is interesting because one of his predecessors, Liz Reedy, had such a list on there from 10 years ago, so it wasn't new. I think what Tom did, which makes sense, is work with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to provide training for those towns that want it or need it. They might also work with some of the audit firms that work with the smaller towns and get everybody on the same page and, as was mentioned, make sure they have best practices.
So basically you think it's sufficient what is being done now?
Well, the state auditor's office is a modest staff. We have a $5 billion state budget, and that's where their primary responsibility is. If towns ask for assistance or if there are opportunities to provide it with the resources, if they're available, then by all means help. But the auditor has to stick with state funds primarily.
We got a question from Jonathan Gibson, who's one of 3 locally elected auditors in the town of Shrewsbury. And he wants to know what specifically you will do to strengthen the capacity of town auditors. He writes, will you, for example, establish a telephone helpline or host regional workshops to enable town auditors to share their experiences and improve their skills? Doug Hoffer.
Sure. If it can be done with the resources available, of course. And in fact, I think, as I said, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns can perhaps facilitate that.
Vince Illuzzi, what do you think about the problem of embezzlement that we've been seeing in local towns and what the auditor can and could or should do?
Well, I've seen it from 2 different perspectives. I'm the Essex County State's Attorney, and I've also seen it as a member of the public reading about these incidents around Vermont. One of the things I would do affirmatively is to make resources available to local law enforcement to assist with the investigation of those complaints. What I've seen as State's Attorney is a real fight between local law enforcement and victims. The local law enforcement agency says, look, we can't do a forensic audit. It's going to cost $5,000, $10,000, depending on the size and scope of the allegation. And the victim says, I've already been victimized. I don't have time like that. When you investigate any other crime, the state provides the resources. So I would redirect resources from the office to assist with that aspect of complaints that come in the door. Secondly, I would continue the practice that has been available at the auditor's office, and that is to make available and strongly encourage the smaller municipalities where the problems occur. There's not enough staff to go around to enact best practices and protocols so that you can quickly spot and detect money not being appropriately deposited and spent.
You just said you would redirect some of the resources, financial resources of the office into this area. So where would you take money from? Well,
it's not necessarily taking money from. There is a professional staff at the auditor's office, and depending on a request coming in from a local law enforcement agency, that forensic auditor could go and look at the books, the data in whatever format it's kept, and make a determination as to whether there has in fact been misappropriation of funds, or if it's larger in scope, to then make certain recommendations. But most folks, when confronted with that complaint, really don't know where the next step is. That includes the police officers with whom I work on a day-to-day basis.
So if you're redirecting funds, but it's not necessarily coming out of somewhere else, do you think that not enough is being done or not enough is efficient in the current auditor's office?
I think the big complaint I've heard from law enforcement is that they have no assistance at the state level to assist with complaints alleging fraud and embezzlement. There's a staff of 10 individuals there who are professional, well-trained, well-qualified. I would make them available to work with the law enforcement agency to the extent possible. It may not be possible to undertake an audit that requires, 4,000 man-hours over 2 years, but certainly the auditor would be able to go in and say, look, based on this preliminary review, we believe that there in fact was embezzlement or fraud, and that as a result, these are the following steps that should be taken. If it's a relatively small amount, the staff auditor should be able to provide the necessary information to the law enforcement agency to then make a determination on whether to prosecute and how to proceed from that point forward.
And to Jonathan Gibson's question, would you establish a telephone helpline or host regional workshops to help town auditors better understand their jobs and improve their skills?
As a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I am assigned to oversee the auditor's office and have had that position for 8 years. There already is, in effect, a citizen complaint line. Complaints come in, they're reviewed by the staff, and then action is taken, either referral out. Sometimes they'll actually send an auditor out to a particular, if it's state money, to the area that the complaint comes from. And if it's a municipality, there's a dialogue with other town managers, the Board of Selectmen, a town manager, at which time a decision is made as to whether the state auditor is requested to engage and provide either review or investigative services. So that's happening now. I would strengthen that and make it clear to every town and city that that service is available and that we would proceed accordingly.
Again, you're listening today to the Auditors Debate on VPR. We're hearing from Vince Illuzzi and Doug Hoffer. And if you have a question for them, you can send it to vermontedition@vpr.net. Should the auditor, through performance audits or otherwise, play a role in crafting the state budget or suggesting appropriate areas for budget cuts? How much of an activist role would you play as state auditor? Vince Illuzzi.
Well, thank you. The word activist sometimes has negative connotations. Clearly, I have worked in the General Assembly, and many of my colleagues are supporting me in this effort. I would be on tap and available to provide information and expertise as developed by the office professional staff, and of course segue that with my experience in trying to provide assistance to the General Assembly, to the executive branch, in fact. But to say that I would be an activist, I'm not sure is the proper term. There are clearly defined duties that the legislature sets for the auditor. I would certainly fulfill those duties, get the audits done in a timely fashion so that when our bond ratings, for example, are issued, that they're relying on current information, and would, in effect, work with the legislature and the executive branch to provide assistance where and when requested.
There have been auditors who have taken on, whether willingly or not, a certain nickname, a bulldog, or they've been seen as a watchdog for the state's finances. And there have been times in the past where the auditor's office was perhaps a more sleepy office. What do you think the role of the auditor is, broadly speaking, in terms of actually going after things that you think are going wrong in state finances?
Well, clearly I have established over the last 32 years that I am not a member of the Go Along to Get Along Club. Sometimes that plays out well. Sometimes it puts you at odds with the leadership, either in the legislature or the executive branch. And clearly, when there is a need to speak out and be independent of either the executive or legislative branch, I've demonstrated that, in fact, I've done that and would continue to do so. The auditor's office in Vermont is independently elected. In other states, it's appointed by the legislature, perhaps by the governor, or it's does not hold one of the prominent positions that it does here in Vermont. So you have to keep in mind the Constitution requires independence. I've demonstrated independence. I would respond when and if necessary. Just this past session, although the governor and I are personal friends and have worked together for almost 2 decades, I challenged him on the $21 million for Central Vermont Public Service. My position was those people deserve to get repaid in cash. And also challenged him on Velco, the state's only transmission grid. Why are we giving control of the state's only interstate highway of electricity to a Canadian corporation, which, although based in Montreal, may be owned by folks who live in some of the most terror-ridden countries of the world? I wanted to have public input and succeeded to some extent. 38% of the board now will be selected by Vermonters, with Vermonters on that board.
Doug Hoffer, same questions for you. How do you see the role of the auditor in crafting the state budget or encouraging or suggesting appropriate areas for budget cuts?
It's not the auditor's job to suggest budget cuts at all. Forgive me. If asked, the auditor can weigh in on any number of subjects, but generally speaking, from my experience as an analyst, I don't want to go where the data doesn't lead me. If the auditor's office has not conducted an analysis of a certain problem, then the auditor shouldn't speak to that issue. The current auditor has done that a number of times, and I think that weakens the office, in my view. So I would not be activist in that regard. Having said that, I would certainly be activist in pursuing the recommendations that come from our reports.
Again, is there a sense that you would take on the mantle of a bulldog or of a watchdog as state auditor?
Well, you can't say bulldog. Ed Flanagan took that one for himself, and I thought it worked pretty well, and he was in some ways. But I don't know that I want to name an animal for my tenure as state auditor or pick one, but I intend to be as rigorous in my approach to the job as I have been in my work. I enjoy that work. I think it's exciting, it's fun, it adds value to the discourse across the street, and I think I've garnered a lot of respect for my work. So I will keep doing what I've been doing, and I look forward to working with the professionals in the office. And by the way, Vince said there were 10. I believe there are only 9 professionals. There are 3 administrative staff and then the auditor and his deputy. So it's not that big.
You said that you would go where the data takes you. How would you determine where to go searching for the data in the first place, or does it just come to you?
Well, the data, I mean, the real predicate question is which issues will you pursue? Which departments, agencies, as Vince mentioned, IT, pops up, those kinds of things present themselves. But when nothing is screaming at you, you have a chance to talk to staff and say, well, we have a number of options. And it's very important that you ask yourself, what are we likely to get out of this? We don't want to commit heavy resources if we don't think we're going to get some return for those resources expended. So you have to be very careful. And if necessary, if it's a potentially large job, then you go and do some sampling and find out if something jumps out at you.
You're listening to the VPR's Auditors Debate on Vermont Edition. In just a moment, the candidates will have a chance to ask one another questions. Now, in this part of the debate, the candidates have a chance to ask one another some questions. And I'll just remind you, the question should be short. This isn't a chance for you to make a policy statement. It's to ask your opponent a question. And the answers should be 60 seconds. There will be time for a follow-up question and answer. All right, Doug Hoffer, you get the first question for Vince Illuzzi.
Thank you, Jane. Vince, I know I've asked you this before, but I'd like to ask again. You've indicated that if you're successful here, you intend to keep your job as the Vermont state's attorney for Essex County, and your explanation was that you had some ongoing cases that you wanted to finish, and I certainly understand that. However, I don't think it's uncommon to turn those cases over to your colleagues in surrounding counties or in the AG's offices, so I'm curious why you wouldn't want to devote all your energies to the job.
Okay, fair question. There are 2 counties in Vermont that are part-time, Essex County and Grand Isle County. The office consists of 1 person. In every other county, there are multiple deputies, assistant state's attorneys, and oftentimes they work cases together. So I have several cases that live in large file boxes that are intricate. They're by and large the ones that tend to not resolve the more heinous crimes, sex offenses against children. And my only point was that it would be unfair to walk out of the office on the day that the person leaves and simply leave those files there. There is no one else to pick them up. I'm only offering my services in the event that that there's no one else prepared to simply pick it up. It would be either as co-counsel, second chair, as they say, but it's certainly not my intent to continue that position for any reason other than to assist in making sure those cases are not adequately prosecuted.
Follow-up, Doug Hoffer?
Well, to say that you don't have anybody else in the office may be true, but you have colleagues in surrounding counties, and I believe, unless I'm mistaken, that the Attorney General's office has concurrent jurisdiction. There are lots of capable attorneys that could take on these cases. The point is, if you allow yourself to stay in that position for a period of time, you can't possibly devote all your attention to the auditor's office, which is clearly a full-time responsibility.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that I would stay in a position. I'm simply saying that there may be a period of 4 to 6 months where I might need to assist in the prosecution of a case, and would certainly, whatever I do, would be with the concurrence and support of the governor's office and the Department of State's attorneys. We would work it out, but I'm not prepared to say that on the day that this term begins, if I'm elected, I'm just going to drop those files, leave the office, just walk out of the office. I just don't think it's fair to do that.
Vince Illuzzi, your first question for Doug Hoffer.
Well, Doug, during the campaign, issued a press release in which he criticized the current auditor, Tom Salmon, for the cost of performance audits and gave a number of either $150,000 or $160,000 per audit. My question is, isn't that jumping the gun and drawing a conclusion before you had all the facts in determining whether some audits cost more because they were larger in scope and some are smaller because they might be the audit of the Essex County Sheriff's Department with one employee?
Actually, the last part first. The Essex County Sheriff's Office audit is not a performance audit, so that wouldn't be part of that group. The fact is they spent $2.4 million and performed 15 performance audits. Of course, since it's an average, some are less and some are more. Indeed, if some are more, then we're talking about really expensive performance audits. There was plenty of information for me to issue that press release, and I stand by it. I think the resources are not being well managed.
But you did acknowledge not receiving all of the data for each of the performance audits, and therefore, based on inadequate data, you drew a conclusion and criticized the current auditor.
Well, you characterize it as inadequate data. I just told you there's $2.4 million and we got 15 performance audits. Furthermore, it's interesting that you think I should be criticized for not using data that the state auditor refused to provide. There was a perfectly reasonable public records request that they did not respond to.
Well, my response would have been you criticize the auditor for not providing the data, but you don't criticize the auditor for mismanaging performance audits because performance audits come in different sizes and scope. If you are auditing the Agency of Transportation for a $500 million transportation and road reconstruction contract, you would expect that would cost more. And if you're doing a performance audit of a smaller grantee or entity, you would expect that it would cost less. So I think it's unfair to criticize someone for performance audits that on average may cost $160,000 when in fact if you had the data you might say, well, these were perfectly legitimate performance audits. Some took longer, some took less, and it was based on size and scope of the job.
Well, since I worked in the office and have performed this kind of work before, all I can say is the average being $158K is incomprehensible. Thank you.
Is there any way you could get the actual numbers for those individual audits?
Request again. I believe there is a process. If the response to a public records request is not sufficient in the view of the requestor, then you can go to another level. I haven't done that yet.
You're listening to the Auditors Debate. We're hearing from Republican Vince Illuzzi and Democrat Progressive Doug Hoffer. This is the round where the candidates ask one another questions. Coming up, we'll hear from listeners. You can add your question to the mix by sending it to vermontedition@vpr.net. Vince Illuzzi, your second question for Doug Hoffer.
Well, Doug earlier in the show criticized the number of personal service contracts that have been that are out in Vermont. I think the number was 300 million. In fact, when you were associated with Ed Flanagan, you yourself worked on a personal service contract that was not put out to bid and which was criticized by the Attorney General and the governor at the time. Wouldn't you be criticizing what you yourself implemented when you were associated with Mr. Flanagan?
Actually, that's an interesting construct of the question. I said nothing about whether those contracts are appropriately bid, although that's an important question. And my contract pales in the context of $300 million. In any case, I don't believe Ed Flanagan's decision to hire me was criticized by the Attorney General or the governor. I am not aware of any evidence of that. It's not uncommon for auditors or any other people in state government to do sole source contracts, and there are provisions in Bulletin 3.5, as you know, to allow that. But first of all, let's go back to the beginning. I did not criticize personal service contracts per se. I acknowledged and noted that they are now up to $300 million in value and simply asserted that it's important for the auditor to pay attention to the larger contracts, just as you have suggested, and I agree, that the larger contracts in AOT, for example, that are tens of millions of dollars, we have an obligation to audit those periodically. And that's what I suggested.
Follow-up?
The follow-up is that based on my recollection of the Howard Dean years as governor, there was criticism that the contract which Doug had not been bid and was really a subcontract to the KPMG contract, and that there therefore was no transparency, and that in fact there was no way for folks to evaluate whether that work could have been done at less cost, better bang for the buck for the taxpayer.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, it was a subcontract to KPMG. They were aware of it and approved it. Second, there was press coverage of this issue, so it was perfectly known to anybody who was paying attention. Jack Hoffman, in fact, who now works with Paul Sillo at the Public Assets Institute, covered this very issue, Vince.
Doug Hoffer, your second question for Vince Illuzzi.
Vince, this past session in the legislature, you co-sponsored a bill to reinstate the 40% capital gains exclusion, which during its tenure cost the state over $150 million in lost revenue, and to my knowledge is not responsible for creating any new jobs or providing any measurable benefit to the state. At a time, as I said before, when we're looking under rocks for money, I'm puzzled as to why you would recommend it now. I've heard you say that it's because you think if we don't do it, wealthy people will leave the state, but there is absolutely no evidence to support that. So I'm curious why you did that.
Well, Senator Hinda Miller and I serve on the Commerce Committee, the Economic Development Committee. One of the complaints that we've heard from the business community is that individuals are reluctant to invest in Vermont, and some individuals, to extend that a step further, are switching their residence, leaving Vermont because of our tax policy. And the legislature is a marketplace of ideas, and when you have a number of business owners as represented by GBIC and the Lake Champlain Chamber, which is where that idea came from, it's incumbent on legislators who are in charge of the policy for the business community to introduce that legislation and have it vetted. Now, the legislation did not pass, but nonetheless, it's important to debate those issues because everyone is entitled to be represented in the General Assembly. And if the business sector is saying this is hampering our ability to invest and do business in Vermont, we try to be as responsive to that as much as we can.
I happen to think that public policy should be based on evidence and the facts and not anecdotes and unexamined assumptions. And just because GBIC or the Chamber asked you or proposed a frankly very self-serving policy proposal doesn't mean it should be proposed, in fact, by you and or your colleagues. There is just no evidence around the country that what you're proposing will lead to job creation. None.
Well, tax policy is set, as is any other state policy, by the introduction of an idea into the legislative process. The Congress has authorized certain deductions, and some states continue to authorize those deductions. Vermont changed that policy, I think, around 2008. And since that time, the anecdotal evidence has been that it is discouraging commerce in Vermont. And therefore, it's incumbent on us to vet those complaints. A bill is just that. It's an idea. It's a proposal that comes oftentimes from special interests or individuals, and it then works its way through the legislative process. That one has not made it, but nonetheless, I think it's worthy of continued debate.
This is the VPR's Auditors Debate on Vermont Edition. Today, we're learning more about the major party candidates for auditor: Doug Hoffer on the Democrat and Progressive ticket, and Vince Illuzzi running on the Republican ticket. Now we're going to turn to the questions our listeners have posed to the candidates. First question comes from Dan in Norton. Dan says, I live in Essex County. It's more expensive to provide services to rural Vermonters than it is elsewhere. One way to promote efficiency is to make rural Vermonters travel to access services. Vermonters who live in Canaan already travel 57 minutes to Guildhall to attend a civil or criminal hearing and 53 minutes to Brighton for a probate hearing. No other Vermonters travel as far to access these services. If elected, will you promote and defend spending money for the benefit of rural Vermonters despite the premium that rural spending demands? Doug Hoffer, that goes to you first.
Well, yes, if I had that opportunity, but the state auditor doesn't participate directly in decisions about appropriating state tax dollars. But I'm certainly sympathetic to the folks in Essex and other very rural counties. And if someone challenges a particular arrangement and says, well, it would cost more, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask the question, are we asking too much of the people who live in these rural areas, and can we make an accommodation for them? So I would support it, but it's not a position or an issue that's likely to come before the state auditor.
Certainly, I represent Essex County and played a role in making sure that the probate court and the court were open. There have been ongoing efforts over the last 30 years to close the probate court and the Superior and Family and District Court in Essex County. Senator Mazza and I, he has the same issue in Colchester. For efficiency of state government, a number of people have, over the years in various shapes and forms, have said we should close those services and move them to the adjacent counties where there is more activity. Now, that's my role as a state senator. And we have been successful, I say Dick and I, because we, as I said, Grand Island, Essex are very similar in size and scope. As auditor, it's not really a role for the auditor because the auditor looks at how money is spent, whether it's done efficiently and whether it's continuing to improve the lives of Vermonters. So appreciate the question, certainly sympathetic to the cause, but cannot say that as auditor that would be an issue for the office. It would be my personal issue, but that would be about where it would stop.
Second question is from Alan, who says, do the candidates think that they should divulge their personal investments and business interests? And if so, when and how will these be made public? Vince Illuzzi.
I've never had that question come up. I know that the state governor, the governor candidates oftentimes will reveal income tax returns. I guess it's an interesting question. I wouldn't have any particular problem doing it. The auditor's office, I think, would have to have an internal control to ensure that whoever is undertaking a fiscal audit has no conflict with the auditee. And that's certainly protocol that's already built in and is part and parcel of the office protocol.
But it's not something you're going to voluntarily do unless it becomes an issue.
I mean, if it became an issue, sure.
Doug Hoffer?
I think it's perfectly reasonable, and I can answer the question. I own my home, at least the part that the bank doesn't own.
But what about, the question was, should you divulge your personal investments and business interests? Owning a home may be just one of them.
I think a lot of people have been talking about this for some time, and the answer we often hear is, well, Vermont's a friendly place. We haven't had a problem. There are very few examples of corruption in the public process, and that's largely true as far as I know. And I think we're inclined to trust people. However, some of these positions deal with significant responsibilities, authority, and money in many cases, and I would have no objection to it.
Our third question comes from Lee in Colchester, who asks, how big of a role do you think the state auditor should play in rectifying and moving forward from the recently discovered issues in the Department of Public Safety? Specifically, I am referring to the overtime/payroll fraud by former State Police Sergeant Deegan to pad his paycheck. Doug Hoffer.
Well, first, I know there's been a lot of attention paid to this issue and a lot of work done, so I would want to know who's done what and where they are in the process. I believe the Secretary of Administration had some work going. I know the department itself was doing some work, maybe the AG's office, and maybe the state's attorney as well. So I'd want to get a sense of what's occurring now. There's no reason to replicate efforts already underway. You don't want to expend resources if they're not necessary. Having said that, if I find that there's a gap and that this office could add value and everybody was in agreement that that was appropriate, then for sure.
I believe that the auditor's office, since the state payroll is largely as a result of state, if not federal money, should play an active role. And at the present time, the Department of Human Resources is buying new software for the state's payroll system. What I have proposed is that we develop a system, and I would work with the office, with the department, to develop a software program that includes the ability to conduct audits so that a department manager or commissioner or secretary can click on a particular division or individual employee and see if there are any red flags. At the present time, in order to do an audit, particularly with the antiquated systems, you have to essentially bring a team in and start wading through paperwork to the extent that it still exists. And believe me, it still exists, as well as the data in whatever format. But other states, in my review, have developed a compliance-enabled timesheet management system. And that does allow, with the click of a mouse, to determine if money is being, if there's fraud. And the other thing that's important is to ensure that there is a protocol in place that does not allow one person to grant himself or herself overtime.
We have a fourth question from Jim Hogue of the Vermont Monetary Reform Group. And this question may be a little complicated for people who haven't been following these issues. But Jim asks, isn't it time we regarded the comprehensive annual financial report accounts as assets to be leveraged and used? If you can shed some light on the successful lawsuits in some venues regarding this, that would be most helpful. Vince Illuzzi.
I'm not sure I can shed any light on that, so I'm going to have to pass with all due respect.
Doug
Likewise.
Hoffer? All right. Well, finally, a question from Celine, who says, I'd like to ask both candidates about the influence of super PAC money in this race. And for Senator Illuzzi specifically, does Vermonters align with his values? Doug Hoffer.
Well, it's unfortunate, I think. The amounts of money in particular are getting to be staggering. And, it brings to mind efforts in other parts of the country for extremely wealthy people to, in effect, try to buy a legislature. Because clearly what's going on now goes way beyond the statewide races that were the initial focus of this thing, including my opponents, well, my race and one other. They're going down into House races. And I think this is offensive to most Vermonters. It's unfortunate. It's legal. But there are a lot of things that are legal that don't seem quite right.
Vince Illuzzi.
A couple of things. First of all, I have renounced to the extent I can, because we're not allowed to talk with those who organize and fund these PACs. I do not want outside money involved in my race or in any other race. I've made that as clear as I can. In fact, there's an article today in 7 Days about how not only have I renounced that effort, although it was in this particular case on my behalf, I've also renounced the comment by Governor Romney that 47% of the people are essentially on the dole. I represent the 47% of Vermonters. I represent the area of Vermont that has the highest unemployment and lowest per capita income. And so simply because I have an R after my name does not mean that I, by any means, accept much of what they say at the national level or what's been happening here in Vermont.
We're going to have to wrap up our debate, but we have time for one final question for each of you before we do. We flipped a coin before the debate, and Vince Illuzzi won and has decided to go second. So the first question will go to Doug Hoffer. One of the main criticisms of you is that you're too much of a policy wonk, too much of a numbers guy, and you yourself say it's all about data. There's also been some talk that you lack management experience, and that is one of the requirements or one of the things that would lead to a successful auditor for the many departments and agencies that you'd have to be auditing. What do you say to your critics and to undecided voters?
Both questions? Well, we'll take the second one first. As to management, yes, I've been self-employed for a long time, but a lot of people might not know, because I don't typically talk about it much, that I was a member of the Burlington Electric Commission for 6 years, appointed by the mayor and city council. That's the entity that oversees the Burlington Electric Department, a $50 million business. And during my tenure, we hired a new general manager. And during that period, I chose to, and I think it was important that I spent upwards of 30, 40 hours a month as a volunteer, both with the new general manager and the senior staff, and was very much hands-on. And that was an important time for that transition. So I have quite a bit of experience dealing with people at that level. And the other question about being a data guy, I'm unclear as to why that would be perceived as a problem. In fact, I have used my skills as a data guy to raise and answer very important questions, which in some cases have saved the state huge amounts of money. It's not just being comfortable with the data, it's having an aptitude for identifying the right question. And that's a lot of what's going on in the auditor's office now, because their work in performance auditing is discretionary. They can choose what to do, and I am very good at that.
Vince Illuzzi, final question to you. One of the main criticisms of you is that your close relationship with lawmakers after 30-plus years in the legislature will inhibit your ability to be neutral as an auditor. There's a worry that you might be too close to those that you'll be auditing. What would you say to your critics and to undecided voters?
Well, thank you. First, the General Assembly has not been the subject of a performance audit, which is the discretionary aspect of the job. Perhaps the question, if better asked, would be, well, you're close with Peter Shumlin and the lieutenant governor and those folks.
You've been involved in some of the programs and processes that might be audited in 30 years in the legislature.
That's right. And I've been endorsed by the Vermont State Employees Association, the Vermont NEA. And so at first blush, you might say, well, he's going to give them a pass. I think my record has demonstrated I do exactly the opposite of that. As I said earlier in the program, when everyone else took a pass on the governor's proposal to not repay the $21 million, not only did I make it a legislative issue, I personally intervened in front of the Public Service Board to cry foul and say, look, this was a contract. There was a commitment. We're going to bail out CVPS. In exchange, you're going to pay us back $21 million if and when the utility is sold. So clearly, I have constructive, long-term relationships with individuals. But if you ask the people with whom I work, it is one of independence, not afraid to speak out. I never have belonged to the Go Along to Get Along Club.
You have been listening to the VPR debate for the open auditor's seat being vacated by Tom Salmon, Democrat progressive Doug Hoffer, and Republican Vince Illuzzi. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Jane.
Our next debate will be Friday with the Attorney General's candidates. Please tune in for that. I'm Jane Lindholm. Thanks for listening.